A high-contrast black screen fades into a grainy, flickering 1944 date stamp as the low, ominous hum of a hurricane-force wind begins to swell. 160,000 men prepare for 24 hours of total chaos, while facing a weather decision that would change the battle's outcome forever. Bold white text appears over the crashing waves, reading June 1, 944. The edge of disaster, as the screen vibrates with the sound of thunder. Rapid-fire cuts show 20-foot Atlantic waves slamming against steel hulls with sharp, metallic, crashing sounds that echo through the speakers. The odds were truly impossible because the English Channel had become a churning graveyard of white foam and freezing saltwater. Historical footage shows Allied ships tossing violently in a massive gale-force storm that threatened to cancel the entire operation. Inside a dimly lit war room, cigarette smoke swirls around a large wooden table while distant thunder rumbles through the thick stone walls. Military analysts argued it couldn't be done, claiming the current weather conditions made any attempt at a landing purely suicidal. A strategic map highlights the massive storm front moving directly over the Normandy coast, sealing the fate of the invasion. An extreme close-up of General Eisenhower's face shows eyes etched with exhaustion and the heavy responsibility of a 1,000-year decision. The rhythmic ticking of a wall clock sounds like a slow-motion heartbeat in the silence of the command center's high-stakes atmosphere. On June 4th, everything changed as the largest invasion in history stalled, leaving millions of men waiting for a single word. A panoramic view shows thousands of ships anchored and shaking under the immense pressure of the wind as radio static crackles with urgent reports. Every expert predicted failure, citing a storm that hadn't been seen in 20 years and waves that could capsize a destroyer. The massive Allied fleet sits vulnerable in the choppy water, a sitting duck for any enemy lucky enough to spot them. In a small, cramped weather station, James Stagg studies a complex pressure chart with the scratching of a pencil marking new, dangerous fronts. What happened in the next 24 hours would completely rewrite modern military meteorological strategy and the way we predict global storms. Red pressure lines on the weather map shift slightly toward the French coastline, revealing a secret only one man could see. A montage shows paratroopers checking silk chutes, while rain lashes against the hangar doors with a rhythmic, violent drumming sound. The heavy metallic clack of rifles being loaded signifies that despite the weather, the soldiers are ready for the ultimate sacrifice. The Allies didn't just survive the gale, they used the environmental chaos as a tactical shroud to hide their massive movements. Quick cuts of German coastal defenses show soldiers relaxed and smoking, believing the storm protects them from any possible naval attack. Wind whistles through the barbed wire of the Atlantic Wall as officers dismiss the possibility of an invasion during such high seas. The method used was a mystery to the German High Command, who firmly believed no fleet could sail in these conditions. The split screen shows a calm meteorologist in England versus a chaotic, rain-drenched naval deck, where men struggled to stay upright. A sudden orchestral swell builds tension as 10,000 planes remain grounded, waiting for a 3-hour window of opportunity in the sky. A countdown timer appears in the corner, ticking toward the final go decision that would determine the future of the free world. They called it impossible. But the weather was about to become their greatest weapon. A high-pitched sonar ping followed by a deep, resonant bass drop echoes across a cinematic wide shot of the dark, stormy horizon. This single moment would define the success or failure of the entire war effort. A detailed map of the Atlantic appears with moving arrows representing the L5 pressure system as low-frequency wind noise vibrates the air. Our story begins in early June 1944. When the most powerful storm in decades hit the coast of Northern Europe with total fury. The timeline marker shows June 3, 1944, indicating there are only 48 hours left until the planned D-Day invasion. Chief Meteorologist James D. Stagg paces nervously outside the High Command's doors while muffled voices of generals argue about the mission's delay. Stagg was a brilliant expert, but he was gambling with the lives of millions of men based on a single barometric reading. A black and white photo of Group Captain James Stagg shows a man carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. A side-by-side comparison shows Allied and German weather-gathering ships struggling in the North Atlantic to find any data on the coming storm. The Allies had superior data because their weather ships were positioned much further into the Atlantic than the German patrol boats. A technical diagram shows the reach of Allied weather stations, compared to the massive blind spots in the German weather network. The close-up shows a barometer needle dropping rapidly into the storm zone as a sharp, whistling wind gust screams through the ship's rigging. On June 4 the invasion was officially postponed, leaving the massive fleet in a deadly, swaying limbo. In the middle of the sea, the text overlay confirms the mission postponement as the gale peaks and the hopes of the Allied commanders begin to fade. Soldiers inside a transport ship are seasick and huddled together as the metal floor beneath them tilts wildly at a 45-degree angle. The sound of metal groaning and water crashing against the hull creates a terrifying rhythm for the men trapped inside the dark holds. Footage shows Higgins' boats bouncing violently as they dive into massive waves, testing the limits of the small wooden vessels. Field Marshal Ramel leaves his post in France to visit his wife for her birthday, believing the storm has bought him a week of peace. The sound of a car engine starting and driving away into the rainy French countryside highlights the total lack of German preparation. Ramel believed the storm was so fierce that an Allied invasion was literally impossible until the next moon cycle. Stagg looks at a new weather chart, showing a tiny, narrow break in the clouds that no other meteorologist had identified yet. A single, hopeful violin note pierces through the heavy orchestral tension of the score as the pressure needle begins to twitch upward. At exactly 9:30 p.m., Stagg noticed the slight rise in pressure, a brief, narrow window of calm in the eye of the storm. Eisenhower looks out a window at the pouring rain, his dark silhouette standing still against the glass as raindrops drum a frantic beat. He had to decide whether to wait for the next tide in 2 weeks or risk everything on a 3-hour window of moderate weather. Still photos of Southwick House show the nerve center where the decision that changed history was about to be whispered. Eisenhower turns to his commanders with eyes sharp and focused, despite the crushing pressure of the thousands of lives at stake. The music stops abruptly, leaving only the sound of the rain outside as the general prepares to give the most famous order in history. He whispered, "Okay, let's go," triggering the largest mechanical and human movement the world has ever seen in a single day. They called it impossible, but the weather was about to become their greatest weapon. A high-pitched sonar ping followed by a deep, resonant bass drop echoes across a cinematic wide shot of the dark, stormy horizon. This single moment would define the success or failure of the entire war effort. Thousands of engines roar to life simultaneously across the southern coast of England as the massive Allied fleet prepares to depart. The low-end rumble of thousands of ships and planes creates a vibration that can be felt in the ground miles away from the docks. The fleet moves out into the tail end of the storm, intentionally using the clouds as a shield against German aerial spotters. Clouds hang low over the water, creating a thick, gray veil over the ships as they cross the English Channel in total radio silence. The splashing of waves against the bow continues, but the wind is noticeably dying down as they enter Stagg's predicted window. An animation shows the fleet moving into the wake of the passing storm system, perfectly timed to hit the beaches at dawn. German radar operators look at fuzzy screens, distracted by the clutter caused by the atmospheric interference of the retreating storm. The rhythmic sweep sound of a 1940s radar dish rotating in the wind emphasizes the vulnerability of the German coastal defenses. Because of the weather, German air reconnaissance stayed grounded, leaving them completely blind to the massive fleet approaching. A close-up of a soldier's hands shows them shaking as he checks his watch in the dark, the ticking sound blending with the music. But here's what nobody knew. The waves were still 6 feet high at the shore, making the landing a gamble even in the calm. Footage shows the Higgins boats bouncing violently as they approached the distant shoreline of France under the cover of night. Paratroopers jump into the dark, disappearing into a thick layer of fog and mist that makes navigation nearly impossible for the pilots. The whoosh of parachutes opening is followed by the eerie silence of the night sky as thousands of men drift toward enemy lines. The low ceiling of clouds forced pilots to fly dangerously low, skimming the treetops to find their designated drop zones. A paratrooper struggles in a flooded marshland because the heavy rain had turned ordinary fields into deadly, water-filled traps. Heavy splashing and the sound of gasping for air highlight the struggle of soldiers carrying 80 pounds of gear through the mud. The same rain that hid their approach now threatened to drown the Allied forces before they even saw a German soldier. The the sun begins to rise behind a layer of bruised purple and gray clouds, revealing the sheer scale of the naval armada. The first distant boom of naval artillery firing from several miles offshore signals the start of the greatest battle in history. As the sun rose on June 6th, the impossible window of weather predicted by Stagg was wide open and waiting. A massive naval barrage lights up the dark horizon with orange and yellow flashes that reflect off the still choppy coastal waters. Thunderous explosions rattled the camera as the first ramps of the landing craft drop into the cold, gray water of the Atlantic. The next 60 seconds would change the world as thousands of men charged into the teeth of the German Atlantic Wall. Soldiers wade through waist-deep water under a sky that is finally clearing to a bright, hopeful blue as the storm retreats. The chaotic sounds of machine gun fire echo off the stone cliffs, but the tactical surprise of the weather has already worked. German commanders were still at breakfast or sleeping, convinced that no invasion could happen on a day with such poor visibility. They called it impossible, but the weather was about to become their greatest weapon. A high-pitched sonar ping followed by a deep, resonant bass drop echoes across a cinematic wide shot of the dark, stormy horizon. This single moment would define the success or failure of the entire war effort. A German general frantically shouts into a telephone as he realizes the beach is being lost to a massive Allied force. Shouting in German is muffled by the sounds of falling masonry and heavy shells landing directly on the concrete bunker roofs. The invasion is here. Tay screamed, but the high command in Berlin still didn't believe the weather allowed for such a fleet. Allied tanks roll off landing craft and onto the wet, shingly sand of the beach, providing much-needed cover for the infantry. The metallic clink-link-link of tank treads grinding over stones and debris signifies the shift from sea to land combat. 2 beaches are secured within the first few hours, and 3 more remain as the weather window holds steady for the troops. Allied aircraft dive through gaps in the clouds to strafe German supply lines and prevent reinforcements from reaching the coast. The high-pitched scream of AP-47, Thunderbolt engine diving at maximum speed, illustrates the power of Allied air dominance. The clear sky finally allowed the Allied air umbrella to protect the men on the ground from any potential German encounter. A medic tends to a wounded soldier under the shadow of a beached transport ship while the sun shines through the clouds. The rhythmic sound of waves, combined with the soft murmurs of a field hospital, creates a somber tone for the victory. Every minute the weather stayed clear. Another 1,000 men reached the shore safely, cementing the success of the invasion's first wave. A close-up of James Stagg shows him back at headquarters, finally sitting down with a cup of tea after 48 hours of work. The sound of a spoon clinking against a porcelain cup marks a moment of intense relief for the man who made the call. Stagg's prediction was perfect, as the ridge of high pressure was exactly where he said it would be at the start. A mulberry artificial harbor is towed across the new calm waters of the channel, looking like a massive concrete island. The low, powerful chugging of tugboat engines highlights the engineering marvel that allowed the Allies to supply their massive army. This tactical innovation required relatively calm seas to assemble, making the weather window absolutely critical for the long-term mission. German prisoners are led back toward the water, looking up at the clear sky in total disbelief at the Allied achievement. The sound of marching feet on wet sand and the distant rumble of outgoing fire fills the air with a sense of change. The Germans had come close to predicting a window, but their lack of Atlantic data made their forecast incomplete and wrong. A German weather map from June 5th is shown, filled with incomplete data and major errors regarding the storm's path. The sound of paper being crumpled and thrown into a wastebasket symbolizes the failure of the German meteorological intelligence units. Their data stopped at the French coast, leaving them blind to the secrets hidden in the vast Atlantic weather systems. Eisenhower visits the troops on the beach, his coat dusty and his face proud as he shakes hands with the survivors. The sound of cheering soldiers and the heavy thud of boots on a metal ramp signals a successful start to the campaign. The impossible decision had successfully landed 150,000 men on the European continent by the time the sun went down. They called it impossible, but the weather was about to become their greatest weapon. A high-pitched sonar ping followed by a deep, resonant bass drop echoes across a cinematic wide shot of the dark, stormy horizon. This single moment would define the success or failure of the entire war effort. A clock face spins forward to late June 1944, showing the passage of time as the Allied foothold in France grows. Fast-paced percussion begins in the score, signaling a shift in the documentary's focus toward the next major environmental challenge. The weather wasn't finished with the Allies yet, as a second and much larger storm was brewing in the distance. The Mulberry Harbor is ripped apart by massive, unexpected waves during a late June gale that caught everyone by surprise. The sound of cracking concrete and twisted metal underwater creates a deep, resonant boom that echoes through the coastal waters. This second storm proved that the June 6 window was a true miracle and the only chance the Allies had. Logistics officers look at charts of sunken supply ships after the second gale destroyed the American artificial harbor completely. A somber, low-toned cello melody begins to play, shifting the mood to one of reflection and serious military analysis. Had they waited for the next tide on June 19th, they would have sailed directly into this total maritime disaster. A what-if animation shows the Allied fleet caught in the middle of the channel during a hurricane-strength summer gale. The sound of emergency sirens and the roar of the winds simulate the catastrophe that would have ended the war early. Military historians agree that waiting 2 weeks would have led to a catastrophic Allied defeat and the loss of thousands. A close-up of a modern-day satellite weather map shows the same Atlantic corridor being monitored by high-tech computer systems. Digital beeping sounds of modern technology highlight how far we have come since the days of hand-drawn weather charts. Today, we take 24-hour forecasts for granted. But in 1944, it was a combination of science, gut, and luck. James Stagg receives a high-ranking medal from a British officer after the war for his service to the Allied cause. A triumphant but dignified brass fanfare builds in the background as the contribution of the scientists is finally recognized. For his impossible call, James Stagg was made a companion of the Order of the Bath by the King himself. A modern soldier in a high-tech command center looks at real-time weather data during a simulated military exercise. The hum of high-powered computers and the soft click of a mouse show the evolution of tactical environmental planning. The tactics and risk assessment models used on D-Day are still taught at West Point and Sandhurst military academies today. Slow-motion footage shows a single poppy flower blowing in the wind on a Normandy cliff overlooking the quiet English Channel. The music fades into a soft, emotional piano melody that allows the viewer to reflect on the historical significance. It serves as a reminder that in war, the environment is often the ultimate commander that no general can ignore. They called it impossible, but the weather was about to become their greatest weapon. A high-pitched sonar ping followed by a deep, resonant bass drop echoes across a cinematic wide shot of the dark, stormy horizon. This single moment would define the success or failure of the entire war effort. The focus shifts to the specialized Allied weather ships, known as corvettes, that braved the Atlantic to send data back. These small vessels sat in the middle of the ocean, vulnerable to U-boats, while recording vital atmospheric pressure readings. The sound of splashing water and mechanical pings emphasizes the dangerous loneliness of these meteorologists at sea during the war. Technical diagrams show how the Allies utilized ultra-intelligence to intercept German weather reports from across the occupied territories. The sound of fast-paced typing and Morse code signals illustrates the silent war of information happening behind the scenes. This layer of intelligence allowed Stagg to see the full picture of the storm, while the Germans remained half-leaned. We see a close-up of the Enigma machine being used to decode a weather report from a German station in Greenland. The metallic clicking of the keys provides a rhythmic beat that matches the tension of the brewing storm front. Every piece of data was a puzzle piece that Stagg used to build his argument for the June 6th window. A map shows the secret weather stations established by both sides in the Arctic, the most remote fronts of the war. Visuals of ice-covered radio towers and frozen soldiers highlight the extreme lengths taken to predict the Atlantic's shifting moods. The weather war was a secret conflict that determined the success of the most visible battles on the beaches. In the bunkers of the Atlantic Wall, German meteorologists are shown arguing about the lack of data from the west. The sound of wind howling through concrete slits emphasizes their isolation from the truth of the coming calm window. They predicted that the storm would last for several more days, leading to the relaxation of the German defense. Visuals of Rommel's empty headquarters in France show maps gathering dust while the commander is hundreds of miles away. The silence of the empty office is a stark contrast to the massive engine noise beginning to build in England. The weather had created a false sense of security that the Allies were now prepared to exploit fully. Allied commanders are shown staring at the same charts as Stagg, their faces illuminated by the harsh glow of desk lamps. The sound of low, urgent whispering fills the room as the final votes for the invasion are cast by the generals. Without Stagg's confidence, the go order would never have been given, and history would look very different today. We see the final preparations of the Higgins boats, their wooden hulls being inspected for any damage from the previous night's gale. The sound of hammers on wood and the smell of salt spray create a sensory experience of the docks. These small boats were about to carry the weight of Western civilization into a storm that everyone called impossible. The final aerial view of the English coastline shows the sheer scale of the 5,000-ship fleet as they begin to move. The sun is hidden behind thick clouds, but the sea state is visibly calming just as the meteorologist predicted. This was the moment of no return, where human strategy met the raw power of the natural world. They called it impossible. But the weather was about to become their greatest weapon. A high-pitched sonar ping followed by a deep, resonant bass drop echoes across a cinematic wide shot of the dark, stormy horizon. This single moment would define the success or failure of the entire war effort. The scene moves to the German perspective as the first radar blips appear. Through the atmospheric interference of the storm, the sound of an alarm bell ringing in a coastal bunker creates a sense of immediate and terrifying urgency. German soldiers scramble to their guns, but the low clouds still hide the true size of the coming fleet. We see the ghost fleet operation, where the Allies used metallic foil to trick German radar into thinking the invasion was elsewhere. The sound of rustling foil and radio static shows the complexity of the deception that the weather helped to hide. The storm made the fake radar signals look like natural interference, further confusing the German defenders on the coast. Allied paratroopers are shown regrouping in the dark French woods, using the sound of crickets to identify each other. The sound of a metal click-clack is the only thing heard, over the wind still blowing through the trees. The weather had scattered them, but it also prevented German patrols from finding them in the chaotic, rainy night. A visual comparison shows the calm seas of the predicted window versus the violent waves that returned only hours later. This emphasizes how narrow the margin of error was for the Allied High Command during that critical morning. Stagg had found a needle in a haystack of bad weather, and he had the courage to bet on it. We see the faces of the young soldiers on the boats, their expressions captured in grainy, period-accurate film styles. The sound of water splashing over the sides and the heavy breathing of nervous men creates a visceral connection. They were the ones who had to execute the plan that the weather experts had designed in their warm offices. The scene shifts to the inland battles, where the mud caused by the storm hindered both the Allied advance and German counter. Visuals of tanks stuck in deep, brown, French mud illustrate the environmental toll of the week's weather patterns. Every movement was a struggle against the earth itself, which had been saturated by the preceding gale force rains. We see a technical breakdown of the S-plan, a specific meteorological strategy used to track pressure ridges across the ocean. Graphics of air masses moving across a globe show the science behind the most important forecasts in human history. It was a masterpiece of 1940s science, conducted without the help of a single digital computer or satellite. The scene shows the relief in the eyes of the naval captains as they finally see the French coastline through the thinning mist. The sound of a ship's horn blowing a low, deep note signals the arrival of the main force at the beaches. The weather had held just long enough for the first wave to establish a beachhead against the odds. We see the German retreat under a clear sky, now fully exposed to the Allied fighter bombers that had been grounded for days. The sound of roaring engines and exploding fuel trucks shows the devastating effect of the weather finally clearing. The environment that had protected the Germans during the storm was now their greatest enemy in the clear. They called it impossible, but the weather was about to become their greatest weapon. A high-pitched sonar ping followed by a deep, resonant bass drop echoes across a cinematic wide shot of the dark, stormy horizon. This single moment would define the success or failure of the entire war effort. The story transitions to the aftermath. showing the massive amount of equipment now safely on the shore under a sunny sky. Visuals of mountains of crates and rows of tanks illustrate the logistical success that followed the meteorological one. Without that 3-hour window, none of this equipment would have made it past the crashing waves of the channel. We see a flashback to the skeptics in the command room who told Stag's prediction was a dangerous fantasy. The sound of their voices echoing in the room reminds the viewer of the social pressure Stag faced during the meeting. He stood alone against the conventional wisdom of the time and proved that science could win a war. The scene shows the Allied weather stations in the Atlantic being decommissioned after the war ended, their job finally complete. The sound of metal doors closing and the wind whistling over abandoned decks creates a sense of the passage of time. These silent sentinels of the weather war played a role as critical as any infantry division on the front. A montage of modern military weather forecasting shows how D-Day changed the way armies prepare for environmental challenges today. Visuals of massive supercomputers and global monitoring stations show the direct lineage of Stag's original work in 1944. We are now in an era where impossible weather decisions are guided by total global transparency and data. We see a close-up of Eisenhower's handwritten note that he prepared in case the invasion failed due to the weather. The sound of a pen scratching on paper highlights the humility of a leader who was ready to take all the blame. The troops did all that bravery could do, he wrote, acknowledging the risk of the weather decision he made. The scene shows the Normandy beaches today, with tourists walking on the same sand where the impossible occurred decades ago. The sound of children laughing and waves gently lapping at the shore contrasts with the violence of the original event. The weather on the beach is calm, a peaceful legacy of the storm that once determined the fate of nations. A final look at James Stag's personal journals reveals the intense stress and lack of sleep he endured during the week of June 6th. The visual of his tired handwriting shows the human cost of being the world's most important meteorologist for a day. He carried a secret that could have destroyed the Allies, and he kept it until the very last moment. The music reaches a peak as we see a fast-paced recap of the storm, the decision, the landing, and the ultimate victory. Each cut is timed to a heavy drum beat that emphasizes the scale and speed of the historical turning point. The weather was the silent protagonist of D-Day, a force that both threatened and saved the entire operation. We see a final quote on the screen from a veteran. "The weather was our shield, and the calm was our open door." The sound of the wind returns, but this time it is a soft, gentle breeze rather than a terrifying gale-force storm. This serves as the emotional wrap-up of the technical and strategic journey we have just witnessed together. They called it impossible, but the weather was about to become their greatest weapon. A high-pitched sonar ping followed by a deep, resonant bass drop echoes across a cinematic wide shot of the dark, stormy horizon. This single moment would define the success or failure of the entire war effort. The final act begins with a summary of the core lesson. That strategy must always account for the unpredictable power of nature. Visuals of modern naval fleets navigating through calm waters remind the viewer that the lesson of D-Day is timeless for any leader. Success is not just about having the most guns. It's about knowing when the wind is on your side. We see a connection to broader military principles, specifically the idea of the fog of war being literal in this historical case. Graphics show how environmental factors can equalize the playing field between a smaller force and a much larger defense. The Allied weather decision is the gold standard for using nature as a force multiplier in high-stakes combat situations. Modern applications are shown, including how disaster relief and search and rescue missions use the same weather modeling today. Visuals of helicopters and Coast Guard ships showed the life-saving side of the science that was once used for a world war. The legacy of the June 6 forecasts continues to save lives in the modern world every single day of the year. A strong call to action appears on the screen, inviting the viewer to engage with the tactical history of the world's greatest battles. If you want more stories of tactical innovation against impossible odds, hit subscribe. The narrator says, over a dramatic shot of the ocean. The viewer is encouraged to join a community that appreciates the technical and human side of military history. We tease next week's video, showing a glimpse of a different historical challenge involving a daring tactical maneuver in the desert. Next week, the desert ghost that fooled an entire army. The text overlay reads, as a new, mysterious theme begins to play. This keeps the audience's curiosity high and ensures they look forward to the next installment of the series. A final image of the OK Let's Go memo is shown, highlighting the simplicity of a decision that changed billions of lives forever. The sound of a single, echoing heartbeat fades slowly into the background, leaving the viewer with a sense of the moment's gravity. The weather was the deciding factor, but human courage was the engine that drove the decision home. The screen begins to fade to black, but the sounds of the ocean remain, a constant reminder of the environment's permanent presence. The music resolves into a final, hopeful chord that lingers in the air as the production credits start to roll silently. The story of the impossible weather decision is a testament to the power of expertise and the necessity of risk. A final text block appears. For James Stagg and the 160,000 who crossed the sea. The visual is simple and respectful, matching the documentary's goal of being educational primary and entertainment secondary. The audience is left with a final moment of reflection before the video ends and the YouTube end cards appear. They called it impossible, but the weather was about to become their greatest weapon. A high-pitched sonar ping followed by a deep, resonant bass drop echoes across a cinematic wide shot of the dark, stormy horizon. This single moment would define the success or failure of the entire war effort.